A police officer strikes an elderly black man with a baton, completely unaware that his son is an army general. What happened next left everyone speechless. Elderly John Carter, a retired teacher and a proud father of Major Daniel Carter, had recently moved to a borderside city with his son. The relocation was intended to bring them closer, as Daniel's new army post was nearby, enabling him to visit John frequently on weekends. Despite the practical advantages of the move, the neighborhood they settled in was not as welcoming as John had hoped. The area was rife with prejudice, and as a black man, John often felt the heavy weight of unspoken hostility from his neighbors. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, John decided to visit the local grocery store. It was a special day, as his son was coming home for dinner, and John was eager to prepare a meal that would remind them both of simpler times. With his shopping list in hand, he strolled to the store, his heart light with anticipation. As John stepped into the store, the atmosphere struck him like a wall of chaos. The store was packed, and the air buzzed with loud voices and the occasional sound of items clattering onto shelves. Customers shoved past one another without so much as an apology, and harsh words were exchanged with alarming frequency. John, ever the composed gentleman, sighed but chose to focus on his task, hoping to gather his items quickly and avoid any trouble. He moved through the aisles with quiet efficiency, carefully selecting fresh vegetables, a well-marbled piece of meat, and a bottle of wine to complete the meal. But as he reached for a box of sugar, a sudden force jarred him. A woman had barged into him, nearly knocking him off balance. Startled, but maintaining his composure, John turned to her and said firmly, "Hey, watch out, kid." His tone was neither aggressive nor unkind, but it was enough to spark the woman's wrath. The woman spun around, her face twisted with indignation. Her voice rose sharply as she sneered, "You slave! How dare you talk to me like that?" The insult cut through the air, drawing the attention of nearby shoppers. John blinked, momentarily stunned by the venom in her words, but he quickly steadied himself, unwilling to let her rattle him. The woman, however, was not content to stop at insults. She escalated the situation, pointing at John and accusing him of harassing her. "This man just threatened me," she cried, her voice thick with mock outrage. Several shoppers paused to watch the scene unfold, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and silent judgment. John clenched his jaw, his heart pounding with a mix of frustration and disbelief. He knew better than to engage with such baseless accusations. Ignoring the woman's tirade, he carefully placed his groceries on the counter and began to leave the store. But the woman, emboldened by the growing audience, was not about to let him walk away so easily. She followed him outside, her voice growing louder as she demanded an apology. "You think you can just disrespect me and leave? Say you're sorry," she shouted, her tone laced with entitlement. John stopped in his tracks, turned to face her, and spoke with measured calm. "Lady, stop following me. Leave now, or I'll call the police. My son is in the army, and I won't tolerate this nonsense." The woman scoffed, crossing her arms as a cold smile spread across her face. "Your son? In the army? Yeah, right. You're just trying to scare me," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. Her laughter rang out, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. As if to prove her superiority, the woman pulled out her phone and dialed the police, claiming that she was being harassed by a threatening man. John watched in disbelief as she fabricated a story, painting herself as the victim. His heart sank as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Minutes later, a patrol car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. The woman immediately rushed to them, her face a mask of distress as she recounted her false narrative. The officers listened intently, nodding as she spoke, while John stood silently nearby, waiting for his turn to explain. When the officers turned to him, John began to speak, his voice steady but firm. He explained how the woman had barged into him, how he had merely asked her to be careful, and how she had responded with unwarranted hostility. But before he could finish, the woman's theatrics escalated. She began to cry, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed, "He threatened me! He's dangerous!" The officers, swayed by her tears, dismissed John's explanation. One of them stepped forward and grabbed John's arm. "That's enough, sir. Apologize to the lady, or we'll have to take you in," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. John's eyes widened in disbelief. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said, trying to maintain his composure, but his words fell on deaf ears. The officer tightened his grip and repeated his demand. "Apologize, now." When John refused, the situation turned violent. The officer shoved him against the side of the patrol car, his baton raised threateningly. "Apologize, old man," he barked. John stood his ground, his dignity intact despite the looming threat. This act of defiance only fueled the officer's anger, and he struck John across the back with the baton. John stumbled, but did not fall. He looked at the officer, his eyes burning with both pain and determination. "I will not apologize for something I didn't do," he said quietly. The officer, his patience worn thin, raised the baton again, but the sound of murmuring from the growing crowd made him hesitate. Despite the physical and emotional pain, John refused to let the incident break his spirit. He straightened his shoulders and walked away from the scene, his steps slow but steady. Inside, however, his heart ached, not for himself, but for a world that still harbored such deep-seated prejudice. This was not the evening he had envisioned for his son's return, but he knew he would face the challenges ahead with the same resilience that had carried him through his many years of life. John Carter stood patiently on the sidewalk, waiting for the police officers to arrive after the woman's dramatic phone call. Despite the accusations hurled at him, he remained calm, believing justice would prevail. His faith in the system was unshaken. After all, he had lived a life of integrity, serving his country and raising his son to follow the same principles. Surely, the officers would understand the truth once they heard both sides. Within minutes, a police car pulled up, lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, their postures rigid and authoritative. The woman wasted no time rushing over to them, her voice rising theatrically as she pointed at John. "That man harassed me. He threatened me and wouldn't leave me alone," she exclaimed, her words dripping with false fear. John opened his mouth to explain, but the officers barely glanced in his direction. Instead, they nodded sympathetically as the woman's voice grew louder, her performance captivating the growing crowd of onlookers. "He called me names and made me feel unsafe," she added, wiping non-existent tears from her eyes. When one of the officers finally turned to John, his expression was cold and accusatory. "What's your side of the story, sir?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already made up his mind. John took a deep breath and replied with unwavering calm, "I was in the grocery store, shopping, when this woman bumped into me. I politely asked her to watch where she was going, and she started shouting at me. I did nothing to harass her." Before he could say more, the woman interrupted, her voice trembling with feigned distress. "He's lying. I felt so scared. He even threatened to call the police on me." The officer's gaze hardened as he approached John. "Sir, we're going to need you to apologize to this lady right now," he demanded. John straightened his back, his eyes meeting the officer's. "I have done nothing wrong," he stated firmly. "She's the one who's lying." The officer's jaw tightened at John's refusal to comply. "Apologize," he repeated, his tone sharper now. "I will not apologize for something I didn't do," John said, his voice steady but resolute. The crowd murmured uneasily as a tension filled the air. The woman, sensing the officer's growing frustration, took her act to the next level. She began to sob loudly, covering her face with her hands. "I can't believe this is happening to me," she wailed, her cries echoing across the street. The officer's patience snapped. "Enough of this," he barked. Without warning, he grabbed John's arm roughly and dragged him toward the side of the road. The crowd gasped as the officer shoved John against a parked car. "I told you to apologize," the officer shouted, raising his baton menacingly. "Do it now, or you'll regret it." John refused to back down, even in the face of physical intimidation. "I have nothing to apologize for," he repeated, his voice unwavering. The officer's face twisted in anger. In a fit of rage, he struck John across the back with his baton. The crowd erupted in shocked cries, some pleading with the officer to stop, while others simply watched in stunned silence. John grunted in pain but refused to cry out or beg. Instead, he crouched low, trying to shield himself from the relentless blows. The officer, emboldened by John's refusal to comply, continued his assault, each strike harsher than the last. "You think you're better than the law, old man?" he spat. "Let's see how tough you really are." As John collapsed to his knees, struggling to protect his head and torso, a sudden commotion rippled through the crowd. The sound of engines revving and boots hitting the pavement broke through the chaos. A military convoy had stopped nearby, its vehicles gleaming under the afternoon sun. Inside one of the lead vehicles, Major Daniel Carter, John's son, had noticed the crowd and the shouting. Intrigued and concerned, he ordered the convoy to halt. "Stay here," he told his men as he stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the scene for the source of the disturbance. Daniel's gaze landed on the group of people clustered near the sidewalk. Pushing through the crowd, his heart sank when he saw an elderly man hunched on the ground, a police officer standing over him with a raised baton. It took only a moment for Daniel to recognize the man. It was his father. "Stop!" Daniel roared, his voice booming with authority. The crowd parted as he strode forward, his military uniform commanding immediate attention. The officer froze, his baton mid-air, as Daniel reached the scene. "What are you doing to my father?" Daniel demanded, his voice trembling with fury. He grabbed the officer by the collar and shoved him against the side of his patrol car. The officer, stunned by the sudden intervention, stared at Daniel in disbelief. "Sir, the officer began, but Daniel cut him off. "Save your excuses," he snapped. "Your actions are inexcusable." Ignoring the officer's protests, Daniel knelt beside his father, carefully helping him to his feet. John winced in pain, but he managed a weak smile as he recognized his son. "I'm fine, Daniel," he said softly. "Don't do anything rash." Daniel's jaw tightened as he supported his father, guiding him toward one of the convoy vehicles. "Get him to the hospital immediately," he instructed one of his men. "I'll deal with this myself." As John was driven away, Daniel turned back to the officer, his eyes blazing with anger. "You'll regret the day you laid a hand on my father," he said coldly. The officer, now pale with fear, said nothing as Daniel walked away, his mind already formulating a plan to ensure justice would be served. At the hospital, John Carter lay on the bed as the medical staff worked to address his injuries. His face was bruised, his back marked with welts, and his hands trembled slightly from the ordeal. Despite the physical pain, his resolve remained unshaken. Daniel stood beside him, his fists clenched and his jaw set, watching every movement of the doctors and nurses. When the medical team had finished, John turned to his son, his voice quiet but firm. "You need to deal with them, Daniel. This has gone too far. People like that woman and that officer, they don't stop unless someone makes them." Daniel placed a hand on his father's shoulder, his anger barely contained. "I will, Dad. They'll answer for this, I promise." He stepped out of the room and took a moment to compose himself. The sight of his father lying vulnerable in the hospital bed replayed in his mind, fueling his determination. Leaving the hospital, Daniel drove straight to the police station, his military vehicle standing out amidst the patrol cars in the lot. The moment he entered, the energy in the room shifted. Officers stopped what they were doing, their eyes following him as he walked purposefully to the front desk. His uniform and aura of authority left no room for questioning. "I need to speak with the captain. Now," Daniel said, his voice commanding. He placed his identification on the counter, a display of his military credentials. The desk officer, clearly intimidated, nodded and quickly made a call. Within minutes, the police captain appeared, his expression wary. "Major Carter," the captain greeted, trying to maintain composure. "What brings you here?" Daniel stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Your officer assaulted my father today. I want to know why this was allowed to happen." The captain gestured for Daniel to follow him into his office, closing the door behind them. Daniel didn't sit, instead standing with arms crossed, his glare fixed on the captain. Explain how one of your men thought it was acceptable to beat an elderly man in the middle of the street. The captain sighed heavily, sitting behind his cluttered desk. Major, I understand your frustration, but the situation is more complicated than it seems. Daniel's voice rose. Complicated? My father is in the hospital because of your officer's complications. Start talking. Realizing there was no avoiding the truth, the captain leaned back and began to explain. He revealed that the officer, identified as Officer Harris, and the woman involved in the incident were married. They've been a problem for years, the captain admitted. Harris and his wife have a reputation. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What kind of reputation? The captain hesitated before continuing. They target people, usually black residents, fabricating incidents to extort or humiliate them. Harris abuses his authority, and his wife plays the victim. They've pulled this act multiple times, but they're careful to avoid leaving evidence. Daniel's anger flared. And you've allowed this? You knew about their behavior and did nothing? The captain flinched at Daniel's tone. It's not as simple as you think. They've covered their tracks well, and complaints often go nowhere. Harris is resourceful, and his wife knows how to manipulate situations. Daniel leaned over the desk, his voice low but seething. Not this time. They picked the wrong target. My father is no random victim, and I won't let this be swept under the rug. The captain looked down, ashamed. Major, I'll cooperate however I can, but we'll need solid evidence to bring them down. Without it, their union rep and legal team will bury us. Daniel straightened, his mind racing. I'll get you the evidence, he said. You just make sure they don't slip away before justice is served. The captain nodded. I'll ensure Harris is monitored, his wife too, but be careful. They won't go down without a fight. Daniel didn't respond. He turned on his heel and left the office, his resolve unshaken. Outside, he called one of his military contacts, requesting access to nearby surveillance footage. If the police weren't equipped to gather the necessary evidence, Daniel would do it himself. Returning to the hospital that evening, Daniel updated his father. John listened intently, nodding as his son detailed what the captain had revealed. They've done this before, Dad, but not again. I'll make sure of it. John smiled weakly, pride evident in his expression. You've always been a fighter, son. Just be smart about this. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his father's arm. Don't worry. This time they won't get away with it. 2 days after John's recovery began, Daniel received a call from the police captain. The couple, Officer Harris and his wife, had been caught red-handed at a local mall. They were threatening a young family over a fabricated dispute, using intimidation and harassment to coerce the family into submission. This time, a vigilant security officer had captured their actions on camera and notified authorities. The evidence was damning. Daniel immediately coordinated with the police captain to ensure the couple wouldn't escape justice. Armed with the security footage, witness statements, and the evidence from his father's assault, Daniel formally filed charges against Harris and his wife. He worked tirelessly, preparing an airtight case with the help of military legal advisors and community members who had also fallen victim to the couple's schemes. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed with community members eager to see the abusive duo face consequences. Daniel sat beside his father, who was still weak from his injuries but determined to witness justice firsthand. As the trial began, the prosecution presented a compelling narrative of systematic abuse, fueled by power and entitlement. The first piece of evidence was the CCTV footage from the grocery store. The video captured the entire sequence: the woman's false accusations, Harris's violent response, and his unprovoked assault on John. The footage silenced any doubts about their guilt. Witnesses from the community were next to testify, recounting years of similar encounters with the couple. Their testimonies painted a chilling pattern of behavior that left no room for sympathy. Then came the mall incident. The security footage showed Harris and his wife cornering a family, shouting threats and attempting to extort money under the guise of law enforcement. The video ended with mall security intervening and detaining the couple. This final piece of evidence sealed their fate. Harris's defense team attempted to argue that his actions were out of character and fueled by stress, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The woman's legal team claimed she was merely supporting her husband, but her role in orchestrating the incidents was clear. As the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. He condemned the couple's actions as a disgrace to law enforcement and humanity. The woman was sentenced to life in prison for her active participation in multiple cases of harassment and abuse. Harris, however, received the death penalty for his violent abuse of power, which culminated in the brutal assault on John. When the sentences were read, Harris turned pale. His wife sobbed uncontrollably, shouting for mercy, but neither received any. Their reign of terror was finally over. After the trial, Daniel helped his father out of his seat, steadying him as they exited the courtroom. Outside, reporters swarmed the pair, asking questions about the case. Daniel refused to comment, guiding his father to the car in silence. Once they were safely inside, John placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You've done the right thing, son," John said softly. "Now, let's move forward. No more looking back."